David is a freelance journalist, communication consultant, and experienced congressional expert specializing in making government more accessible to a wider audience, which I think is really terrific. He's appeared as a guest commentator or an analyst on many national news outlets, including Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and NPR. David is also the founding editor-in-chief of the Fulcrum, a digital news site covering American democratic reforms, and he's also the editor of Congressional Quarterly and Roll Call. So, without further ado, we welcome David.
Thank you very much. I will probably roam away from this because I tend to move. Can you all hear me if I do that? Yeah, I don't want to do that. So thank you very, very much for asking me to do this, fellow Rotarians and people some of whom I've known since the mid-1960s, believe it or not. Ernie in the back, and I went to elementary school. As Jay was just saying, we moved to Chestnut Hill in 2021 after I lived in Washington and I was a Washington correspondent and editor for 35 years. And sadly for me, when I got to Washington, it was more or less functioning. And I got to watch its relatively steep and steady decline into total dysfunction, especially in Congress. By the time we left, and it was really one of the reasons why we decided to leave was it just wasn't a fun. It was depressing, to be honest. So I think our fifth test is will it be fun? I might not live up to the will it be fun today because this is somewhat of a downer of talk. So why did it decline? First, very quickly, why did it decline? A couple of big macro reasons. You all may know that what was once a divided Democratic and Republican South changed. We had the solid South became Republican. That led to a more pure alignment, ideological alignment between the Democrats and the Republicans. That produced more party unity. And then that also led to the takeover of Congress by the Republicans in 1994 for the first time in 40 years. And ever since, so that was the Newt Gingrich revolution. And since then, and especially since the virtually tied election of 2000, control over Congress has been at a knife's edge. Only one party has had more than 53% of the House seats just once. One party has had more than 54% of the Senate seats just once since 1994. So it's right on the edge. And when control of Congress is essentially up for grabs every election, that sort of produces a sense of teamwork, and we got to all buckle in and act as a team and win control and win power. Because of course, in a democracy, I guess winning the power is at the core of what they're about. The other thing that the core of what they're about is they do what works, right? Politicians do what works. And we live in an increasingly divided country, self-sorted divided country, and a polarized country. And so if the constituents are polarized, they want their lawmakers to be polarized, they'll act that way. So that's sort of the macro view. Now the I promised 5 M's. I am going to add a 6th at the very end. So stick around for the surprise 6th to really knock your socks off. But the first 5 are, which I'll try and do each one in about 4 or 5 minutes so we can have time for questions: money, maps, media, and then the other 2 are mingling, a little bit hard to understand, and masochism. And then what the hell, I'll tell you what the 6th one is. It's unfortunately mobs. Money. I guess I would have to say that's number 1 with a bullet, as they used to say on the radio. Nothing has drained the civility and collaboration out of Congress like the incessant chase for campaign cash. And it has been astonishing. Even the number I'm about to give you is adjusted for inflation. Even adjusted for inflation, the total amount spent on congressional campaigns has tripled in the past 25 years, tripled. And last year in the 22 election, $9 billion. $9 $9 billion spent by the candidates, the parties, and independent groups. $9 billion. It's absolutely going to be more. You all may know that the Citizens United case from the Supreme Court, now 13 years old, essentially unleashed the power of independent groups to spend whatever they want to win elections, and they are spending whatever they want. So, for example, in my new adopted home state, Pennsylvania, you might think that the amount spent by Dr. Oz and John Fetterman by themselves was astonishing. The two of them spent $125 million between them. But the amount spent by outside groups on that Senate race was $235 million, more than double what the candidates themselves spent. So this is a lot of money. So, and whether they're competitive races or not, like the Fetterman-Oz race was, the hot Senate race in the country in 22, members are persuaded and convinced that raising a ton of money is the best insurance policy to get reelected and to ward off any challenge. It's prophylactic fundraising. They want to raise as much money as they can to just scare off any would-be challengers, and it works most of the time. There were actually 28 senators on the ballot last year, 28 incumbent senators running for re-election, and they spent an average of $27 million, and they all won. Every single candidate who ran for re-election to the Senate last year won. They spent an average of $27 million. Their challengers spent an average of just $2 million. So raising all this money works. House members similarly. Take, for example, the congressman for where we're sitting right now, Dwight Evans. His Republican opponent raised so little money that he wasn't even required to file a report with the Federal Election Commission, which means he raised or spent less than $5,000. Dwight Evans spent $1.1 million. So he had all this money in the bank, and it was an insurance policy that works. Even one that was moderately competitive, just across the line here, Madeline Dean, who represents Montgomery County, she spent $2 million, and she won 3 out of every 5 votes against a guy whose name was Nascimento, who spent just $200,000. So it's a 10-to-1 ratio, and it wins, and it works. So this fundraising, why do I bring all this up? Not only does it suggest the polarized nature of things, but this fundraising takes time. It takes a lot of time. And it takes essentially time to the exclusion of many other things that members of Congress should be doing, like mingling with their colleagues, or reading briefing papers, or talking to their colleagues about legislative deal making. Instead, during almost every waking hour, when they don't have something else that they absolutely have to do, they are dialing for dollars. If you see a picture of a member of Congress with a cell phone up to his or her ear, you can bet your bottom dollar that they're calling a donor. They can't do it from their offices, but they can do it. There are call centers on Capitol Hill that look like little telemarketing firms, little cubicles, where they go and they park themselves with a call list, and they make calls on the way to the airport. They make calls from home before they go in the morning. When they're not making calls, they're at fundraisers. When they're in Washington, fundraising to the exclusion of many other things, including talking to people on the other side. So that's money. Did I do it in 4 minutes?
Yeah.
And as I said again, 100% of the senators won. 94% of the House members who ran for re-election won last year. So why isn't there more turnover in Congress? Part of it is that the country itself, as I said a minute ago, has self-sorted. The so-called education divide, which is now the main divide in American politics, where the more education you have, the more likely you are to live in a city or in a close-in suburb and vote Democratic. The less educated you are, less likely to live in outer suburbs or in rural America. We self-sort, and when we don't self-sort, the map makers make sure that we are sorted in a partisan way. How sorted have we become? If you think about the next election, if you've been starting to pay attention to the next election, which I have a feeling most of you have, you may realize that the number of states that really might be competitive, where the electoral votes really might be up for grabs next year, is down to about 5. We happen to live in one of them. We happen to probably live in the biggest of the swing states. But there are only 5 states. In the Romney-Obama election of 12, there were, I went back and looked because I covered that one pretty closely. There were 13 states that were genuine, could have swung either way until close to the end. Now we're down to 5. There are only 5 states left that have one senator from each party. That is an all-time low. And it got lower by 1 in Pennsylvania last year when we replaced Patrick Toomey with John Fetterman. And the number could go down to maybe 1 or 2, actually, after the next election. Joe Manchin, for example, is leaving, likely to be replaced with a Republican. The states themselves are a weird form of gerrymandering that for lots of interesting historical reasons. Why does North Dakota and South Dakota have what they have? You think that, and that tips the balance of Senate dysfunction. There are 9 states that have half the country's population. It's the most populous 9 states, half the country. California has 67 times as many people as Wyoming. So that's a form of gerrymandering, right? But it's nothing compared to what happens in the House because the state boundaries are set. I don't think we're gonna, much as there's talk in geeky academic circles about maybe North and South Dakota should be made to live together and California should be divided up into 5 states. None of that stuff's gonna happen. What does happen, however, is that the maps of the House are being redrawn constantly. It used to be once every decade. Now, whenever one side or the other gets an advantage, they try and redraw the House maps. North Carolina is the state Supreme Court, which had ruled against one North Carolina map, has now changed ideological balance, so they're going to redraw the map. New York State just yesterday, the state Supreme Court in New York allowed the Democrats to try and redraw that map. So there's constant redrawing. What the result is, very few seats are competitive. How few, in fact? There are just 5%. So there are 435 seats in Congress, something that's not set by the Constitution. It's just set by law, actually. That Congress decided about 100 years ago that we're going to limit the size of the House to 435 seats. Just 5% of them have a member of Congress from a different party than the way that district voted for president. So just 23 members of Congress are from one party that voted differently from the way their constituents voted for president. So that's kind of a pretty good way of measuring what a purple district is. 2 of them are in Pennsylvania. One of them is in Bucks County. Brian Fitzpatrick, a Republican, his Bucks County constituents voted for Joe Biden in 2020. And a guy named Matt Cartwright, who represents the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton area, Democrat, represents a Trump district. So they are vanishingly rare. I mean, back when Richard Nixon won re-election, right? Any of you in this room, I can sort of size you up as probably voted in Richard Nixon's re-election in 1972. So think about that, right? Richard Nixon won a landslide re-election in 1972. And in that same election, they elected something like 280 House Democrats. So we were a lot more split districts back in the day. What about next year? So it's self-sorted or self-sorted. So looking ahead to next year, I subscribe to several political rating services. So we're looking at the congressional races. I do some of it myself. There's a consensus view that essentially only 1 out of every 7 congressional districts next year might be remotely competitive. Put another way, that means 6 out of every 7 districts are locked in for one party or the other. And that sort of leads up to the big dysfunction conclusion, which is if 6 out of every 7 districts are locked in as either solid deep blue or solid deep red, that means the only election that matters is the primary. And winning re-election means getting renominated. And so what do you do when you want to get renominated? You appeal to your base voter. And the base voter is who you have got to appeal to if you want to stay in Congress. And it's the base vote that is the most polarized. So that's hello. So that is maps in 5 minutes. Media. Media landscape totally different than even when I was growing up, and when many of you formed media habits that are different than a large part of the country now. Local newspapers are almost extinct. There was a study just last week that more than half of the counties in the United States have either 1 or 0 newspaper. More than half the counties in the United States. Even the big papers and the big papers, the ones that we would think would be covering Washington and covering politics and holding members of Congress to account, have largely abandoned Washington coverage. My first job, before I went to Congressional Quarterly and Roll Call, my first job was covering Congress for a big chain of small newspapers. These were small newspapers. These were in places like, I mean, one of the biggest papers in the chain was in Easton, Pennsylvania, for example. It was one of the biggest papers, but they had a Washington bureau, and they let me cover Congress for this big chain of small papers. That's totally gone. And people, you go up to Capitol Hill now, and people sort of, what? The Philadelphia Inquirer had a great Washington correspondent named Jonathan Tamari. He left, he went to Politico last year, not going to be replaced. So this is the Philadelphia Inquirer, right? One of the largest papers in the country. Nobody to cover Dwight Evans, Alan Dean, Fetterman. And they do it all by phone. Sometimes there's a woman who covers politics who drives down to Washington, but nobody to hold them to account. So when there's nobody to hold them to account, they can sort of broadcast directly to their constituents. I mean, there's no filter. They have direct access to their constituents. Social media makes this quite easy. Social media, I think we all would agree, is a relatively polarized environment. It tends to be an echo chamber where people on social media are talking to one another. They're talking to people who are like-minded. If they don't talk to people who are like-minded, they make little choices on social media that get the algorithms working, and pretty soon you're just being fed what the algorithm thinks you're going to like to read. So it's this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where the liberals see nothing but liberal media, the conservatives nothing but conservative media. People are not, and of course, making a subtle point on Facebook or Twitter is kind of difficult, right? Making a sort of a purple point. I mean, Twitter and social media thrives on being dogmatic, polarizing, exactly, sort of insistent. So social media, not a friend of collaboration and consensus and civility. Cable news, of course, terrifically polarized. Although in cable news, just as I think this might come as a surprise to many, how many people watch cable news in prime time? You are among fewer than 2% of people, the voting age population, who watch cable news in prime time. By the way, all right, sorry, how many people voted in the 2020 presidential election? How many people voted in the 2022 midterm election primaries? Okay, great. So you guys you're outliers.
I knew it.
But in a good way. So primetime cable, only 4 million people watch the big four combined. So, yeah. Just fewer than 4 million people watch Fox, CNN, MSNBC, or the other conservative ones. Now got
Newsmax?
Oh yeah, Newsmax. I think is number 4. But Fox has about half, but it's only 4%. I mean, it's only 2% of people who are voting age, whereas still, actually, the nightly network news gets 19 million people, 19 million eyeballs watch ABC, CBS, and NBC. Still, aging population. But what the politicians are after are those 4 million people who are watching primetime cable, because they're the ones who are going to vote. That's their core, that's the base, right? I mean, if I'm coming back, that's my theme, right? It's the base. Why are we polarized? Because the base matters. Money reinforces the base, the maps reinforce the base, the media reinforces the base. How do they reinforce themselves? Now we're on to number 4, mingling. And that's less about the macro, what's going on in the country. And the next two, this one is sort of about what goes on Capitol Hill. Because they're raising so much money, because they feel compelled to go back and appeal to the base by going back to their districts or their home states almost every weekend. Very few of them live in Washington anymore, which is very different than when I first got there, when members of Congress would buy houses in Washington, send their kids to school in Washington, have barbecues on the weekend with one another. They really used to do that. I mean, that was really a thing. like, everybody from the Indiana delegation would gather at Dick Lugar's house for on a Saturday afternoon for a barbecue. None of that happens anymore. They don't hang out. They don't talk to one another. They're so busy during the week raising money that they don't even talk to each other. You ask a member of Congress, which I used to do this, like when there was a pause in the conversation. When was the last time you had a social interaction with somebody from the other side? And or just even a non-business interaction of any kind, they would look at you blank, like, wow, that doesn't happen anymore. So when that mingling doesn't happen, there's not a chance to shoot the breeze. There's not a chance to find areas of common ground on, even on parochial matters. I mean, the big states like Pennsylvania, Texas, they used to have every member of Congress from a big state like Pennsylvania would get together for breakfast or lunch once a week to talk about, if they couldn't talk about, tax policy or trade policy or defense policy, they could at least talk about, what's important to Pennsylvania. How do we get together as both parties to make sure that, the money for the Pennsylvania Turnpike repaving gets done, or the money for Philadelphia Airport that gets done. That kind of stuff doesn't happen anymore. They're just all siloed. The Blues against the Reds. Even the annual, sometimes you see, that picture of me that was in the Chestnut Hill local with me sort of in the background with Boehner and a couple of other members, that was actually taken at a party for the Congressional golf tournament. I mean, everybody's trying, all these trade associations and nonprofits and my news organization would try to put on things to get members to come together, like the golf tournament. My place did a baseball game and a golf tournament, and the baseball game drew like 20,000 people to play in that stadium. But it was Republican members against Democratic members, and all the Republican members sat on the third. All the Republican staff and lobbyists sat on the third base side, and so it's totally polarized. They don't even talk to each other. So masochism. Number 5 on the masochism. It's getting better. Has anybody ever heard of the golem effect? There are some. Anybody heard of the golem? All right, so the golem effect is apparently it's a psychological thing. Golem apparently is a figure of Jewish mythology, an unformed clay monster, and the golem effect is the concept that if people in authority tell a group that they're lousy or that the expectations are low, that group will live up to the low expectations. The inverse can be also true, but that if you tell a group if you're lousy, they'll do lousy work, and then that lousy work will reinforce the perception that they're lousy, and they'll do more lousy work. And that is what we have in Congress today. Constituents tell their politicians that they're working in a lousy place that does lousy work, and members of Congress respond, or congressional candidates respond, by actually railing against the very institution where they want to go and work. And then they get to Washington and they feel like they have to perpetuate the golem effect. They have to perpetuate this notion that they're doing lousy work. And they do this in some ways, like sort of self-denial. Dozens of members actually sleep in their offices. They sleep, and their constituents are coming in the next day, or lobbyists, and sitting down on the very couch where the member just rolled up his bedroll. So they sleep in their office. They've denied themselves a pay raise for now 14 years. They're supposed to get a cost of living increase. The number was 174,000 14 years ago. Every year since then, Congress has affirmatively voted to deny themselves the pay raise. They have, with a few rare exceptions, year after year, they have starved their own office budgets so that the staff is dramatically underpaid. They stay a nanosecond. The average congressional staffer stays only a couple of years. So the brain drain is significant. Of course, they live up to late night comedians' ridicule. And this sort of self-denial is sort of the very essence of I wrote down the definition of masochism. they're deriving success from perpetuating their own pain or humiliation. That's a sort of definition of masochism. So time left for the sixth, which is the saddest one of all, mobs. So I originally wrote the five when I was leaving Congressional Quarterly and starting up this thing called the Fulcrum. I wrote this, started giving this talk, and I just had the five, but it's only gotten worse in the intervening years. Hence, number six, mobs. We know what happened. I mean, January 6th was a mob, of course, but there is mob behavior at both ends of the ideological spectrum. There's actually a little trade association that represents former members of Congress. Not every former member of Congress wants to become a lobbyist. Some of them actually want to do good work. And this group called the Former Members of Congress helps them do it. And they did a survey of recently departed members of Congress, 300 of them, and half said that they had felt threats to their personal safety more than infrequently. I think it was, somewhat or frequently while they were in office. So these members feel that they're at personal risk and that their families are at personal risk. And clearly the Capitol Police agrees with them, because since January 6th, the budget for the Capitol Police has gone up by almost 50%. They've actually opened field offices in Los Angeles and Houston and Atlanta. I think they're going to open up another one somewhere in the Northeast soon to just help protect these members, because the anger of the country has grown intense. Members are scared. Their response to being scared is to not do anything to tick off their base. When you tick off the base, there is hell to pay. I mean, we should just remember that these so-called second Trump impeachment, the one that the House voted to impeach Donald Trump after January 6th for his role in the insurrection. 10 Republicans voted for that impeachment. 8 of them were not renominated for another term. 4 of them lost in primaries. 4 of them just gave up because they knew they were going to lose. But 8 out of the 10 are not back. And many of them, I mean, they don't say this often on the record, but they say they feared for their families. They felt scared. While not wanting to do a false equivalency here, I would say that there can be similar levels of anger on the left as well. So this is not just a one-way thing. There are really, really angry people on the left as well who, and some of this we've seen bubble up in recent weeks with the Israel-Hamas war, where people on the left feel scared as well. So there you go. That's your, that was fun. So by the way, I'm here. I'm happy to take questions until we have to leave the room, and I'm also happy to just go stand outside in the cold and talk all morning. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you. Really grateful. So there's 2 things that really strike to my mind. They're kind of like the same question I asked you 2 ways. One is, let's put a scenario together where things are working. So what institutions is that threat? Because the other thing I keep thinking about, if things are locked in as they are, who's benefiting from this? There's got to be some benefit. Why I ask that is, like, there's subsidies for the oil industry that have been in place for 100 years. That kids get voting in. Look at the way that defense contractors work, like an Osprey or something like that. Little pieces get built into every state so that there's no chance that it's going to be cut. So I want to think of it from your view, talk about that. If this is so dysfunctional, is there someone or organization that benefits from the dysfunction?
That's a really great question. I mean, one of the oldest cliches in Washington policymaking is that most industries just want certainty. So I guess my initial response is stasis is a version of certainty, a version of predictability. If they know the tax code's not going to change, they're good. If they know that the defense policy, that our decision to build as many ships as we're building is not going to change, that's good. So I think K Street is okay with this. Another thing is, and I sort of flicked at this at the end, the brain drain in Congress is significant. I mean, if we have the 3 branches of government, our Article 1 was initially the idea was Congress was maybe supposed to be the most influential of the three. I would say it's now become the least influential of the three, the least able to steer policy. There are, I would be surprised if somebody in this audience doesn't ask about term limits. Is term limits the solution? So I'll just go right there and address that. No, it is not the solution. There are significant term limits already, maybe too many term limits, which is to say that you may be surprised to hear this, given you see Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, and those all look like really familiar faces for a long, long time. But just beneath that, the turnover is astronomical. The number of people who come to Congress, stay for 2 or 3 terms, and leave because they hate the thing, because of the goal. And it's like, oh wow, I ran against Congress, and then I had to come and behave like I was furthering that, and I'm out. Or they run for another job. It's significant. The number of there are only like 6 members of Congress left who were in office when Reagan was president, and only maybe, I'm going to just guess, 20 more who were in office when Bill Clinton was president. There's a large-scale turnover. So, and the staff, even faster turnover, as I said. I think the average tenure is 2 years, maybe less, of staff member. So that kind of knowledge means that gives the lobbyists the power, right? Those staffers, what do they do after 2 years? They go downtown. They go to a trade association. Some young, some 25-year-old person who did 2 years as the defense aide to a member of Congress on the Armed Services Committee goes to work for Raytheon or goes to work for the American shipbuilders, and brings a little knowledge there and makes a whole lot more money. So anyway, I think the stasis. Who benefits from the stasis? I think special interests, K Street, the swamp.
In your opinion, what, if anything, can be done to change?
Yeah, that's the big question. I think I used to say 2 things. I used to say 2 things that could change it would be a cataclysmic event like 9/11, which wiped away partisanship for about 6 months. And so then when COVID happened, I thought, oh, maybe this is it. Totally wrong. The congressional response to COVID was as partisan as anything I've ever witnessed. So I think the only other alternative is for that knife's edge thing I talked about at the start to come to an end somehow. I mean, Congress worked pretty well whether you liked it ideologically or not. It worked pretty well in the early 90s and then the 80s and then during the back into the Great Society time, because one side was absolutely in control and the other side was just sort of like begging for scraps. So if the balance of power tips decisively to one party or the other, so there's not this incentive that, oh, we're going to win it back next time. So let's act, the team, you got to take one for the team and do it. If that dynamic were to end with one side, because one side was in control of the other, that might help bring things back.
Would it be possible?
You're supposed to say, I have a follow-up. That's what you do that's what you do at the White House. Yeah.
Could there be a constitutional amendment that would limit the amount of money that was allowed?
There could be. There's actually a couple of groups out there that are raising money for a campaign to try and persuade Congress to essentially write a constitutional amendment that would effectively overturn that Citizens United rule. But it's not going to go anywhere. Who's next? You're next.
I understand this stalemate in Congress, but even on finance bills, why does it take 60% of the Senate to pass anything?
Oh, well, I mean, that's because that's the rule the Senate has set for itself. I mean, that's not in the Constitution. That is just a rule that the Senate has set for itself. They've actually trimmed that rule several times in the last 10 years, because it used to be this the so-called 60 vote threshold, the filibuster threshold. Well, first of all, it used to be as high as 67 votes, and they turned it back to 60. And then they, over time, did away with it on nominations. So nominations now can be approved with a simple majority vote. So why, I mean, why are they not going to change it further? Because the Senate, well, for one thing, if you're senator from the minority party, this gives you power and you're not going to relinquish it. And in order to change the rule, you have to go through all kinds of shenanigans.
Yeah,
am I answering your question?
Well, yes, partly, but it's on every bill. I mean, I know that on budgetary items, you need a bigger number, but on anything.
Well, yes, and this 60 vote so-called filibuster threshold has existed for as long as any of us have been paying attention. It was a weapon that was rarely used. I mean, there's sort of some historic precedent that this filibuster should only be deployed in extraordinary circumstances. It was famously deployed during the fight over civil rights in the 1960s, and then it largely subsided. And as the place has become more polarized and partisan and evenly divided, you know, old norms have, I mean, it's sort of a macro story about our politics generally. Old norms have gone away, and the old norm, you don't do this on every little thing, has been tossed out the window. Yes, sir.
So kind of piggybacking on everything else, historically, have we ever been here before, and how did it play out then? Where do we, how does it go? How does this
play out?
Yeah.
So I'm not, I don't pretend to be too much of a, you know, a deep historian. There were times in the 1890s when, after the contested election that should have made, we should have had a President Tilden instead of a President Hayes. And this was the so-called corrupt bargain where Tilden basically, he won the popular vote. He was like one electoral vote away, but he didn't have it. And then they decided to make Hayes the president instead in return for the South, in return for pulling out federal troops and ending Reconstruction, essentially. That's oversimplified only a little bit. But then in the period after that, things were pretty polarized during the sort of robber baron era. Things were pretty polarized. But I don't think like this. I mean, you just think about so Congress is going to go home, supposed to go home on Friday for the year. What have they done this year? I mean,
Nothing.
I mean, everything they've done is sort of, I mean, they kicked out George Santos. They took 15 tries to elect a speaker. Then they took 4 tries they fired him, and they took 4 tries to replace him. They avoided a default. They postponed a shutdown, and they untangled this huge nominations mess of their own making, which meant there were essentially no new general officers in the armed forces for months and months. I've never seen it remotely that do nothing, and I've been watching since the late 80s. You know, they're going to go home without, probably they're not going to give any more money to Ukraine. They're not going to replenish the Iron Dome in Israel. There's talk this morning as we're waking up that there might be some big deal on these things, on immigration. You know, Biden wants to cut a grand bargain on immigration. Call me cynical with some justification, I think, but even if it's the old Groucho Marx thing about whatever he's for, I'm against it. Did anybody ever see Horse Feathers? That if Biden announces some deal on that he's cut a deal, the odds that the House Republican majority would pass whatever Biden's for, I think, are slim. So I don't know. We're in a bad place. I should look. Let me just look at the back. Am I not seeing in the back room? Anybody got a hand up in the back? Otherwise, I'll go with Tim. Hey, Tim. Hi, Tim.
Hi. So I was in advertising in the early 80s, and every ad we put on television, we had to get legal approval for. And I'm watching the media now thinking, what's the FCC doing with all this stuff that's going on in the media that is blatant lies? And why aren't they controlling this more? It's crazy to me, the distortion on both ends.
Yes.
All the time that goes on, and it's just allowed.
Well, That's such an old-fashioned question. Because, but I mean, for one thing, it's like, I mean, the FCC, think of what little of our media diet the FCC now actually controls. Right, broadcast television. They don't oversee cable, and they don't oversee they don't oversee social media. The fairness doctrine, which was used to regulate back when we were all younger, when broadcast over-the-air, rabbit-ear television was king, there was this, the FCC had this thing called the fairness doctrine, where you had to give equal weight to both sides in a political debate. That's gone by the wayside. So I mean, it's self-regulated. I mean, today's FCC is Elon Musk. I mean, he's the one who's deciding what's fair and equitable.
Is there any discussion that this has got to change?
Yes, there is discussion that is, yes, but that would require Congress to reach a consensus on changing it. And I don't think that's likely to happen. So it's, we're not in here, not a good place. Yes, Ernie.
David, thank you for your presentation. You warned us that it was going to be depressing.
Right.
I think we're all
Depressed
here because we're optimistic realists. And so we have the 6M. What is drawing good candidates into Congress today, if it's even possible?
Well, the shortage of ambition has not declined, I don't think. Although, so that's a wonderful question. I mean, there's still, I mean, it's a great question, and despite everything that I have said, and this goes to a classic poll. There's a classic polling thing where for decades and decades, people have loved their congressman but hated Congress. People love their member. They think their member, she's good, she's taking it seriously, but I hate the institution. Having worked there and talked to many of these people, I sort of understand that in a different way, which is to say, when you talk to most of these people, they have a servants. Most of them do this. I don't think they do it for venal reasons. I think George Santos is an absolute outlier. Most members have a servant's heart. Most members do this. They come to Washington with good intention. They want to get things done. They want to make friends. They want to find compromise. I think many of them, when they just and then forces in many cases overtake them. Their leadership tells them, you need to be spending less time trying to find, a compromise on whatever, on the farm bill, and more time raising money, not just for yourself, by the way. And I should say, the people like Dwight Evans, in the safe seats. By the way, we are now sitting in the second most lopsidedly Democratic congressional district in the country. FYI. And that is measured by how much better the presidential candidates do in a district than how they do nationwide. So if Biden won 53% in this congressional district, the 3rd congressional district of Philadelphia in 2020, I'm sorry, he won 53% nationally, and he won 96% in this congressional district. So that's what's known in Washington as plus 43. And there's only one other place. There's a district outside of Washington that's, I think, plus 44, and another one in Los Angeles that's plus 44. But anyway, so somebody like Dwight Evans, I mean, I only know a tiny bit. I mean, he's made a career in politics. Why did he get into politics? Because he wants to get things done. And then they're overtaken by this demand that instead they play for the team and they raise money for the team. And so I do think we're still, yes, people are ambitious, but most of the people who run for Congress are decent. They're decent folks. They really are. So hopefully not too many of them will get talked into leaving or talk themselves into leaving after such a short time. All right. Yes, ma'am.
How much do you think the primary system is contributing to the dysfunction? It seems like the parties are being more and more controlled by the fringes. We're getting candidates.
Yes. Oh, that's right. So that's part of this whole, my discussion of the base, right? Is the people who are controlling the primaries are the core, the base, the most liberal, the most conservative. And so the candidates who are winning tend to appeal to those folks. Pennsylvania has, unlike many states, but Pennsylvania has a very restrictive system, right? We have what we call closed primaries here, where you have to be a registered Republican or a registered Democrat to vote your primaries. Many other states, an increasing number of states, Florida most recently, are breaking the back on that and allowing people who are unaffiliated to vote in primaries, or allowing people to switch on primary day and vote. And that allows more independents, more centrists to have a say. Pennsylvania not there yet.